Welcome to the Research Reimagined podcast, brought to you by Nottingham Trent University. I'm your host, Helen Darby-Dowman, and I'll be inviting some of NTU's brightest minds to explore how their research is helping us to deepen our understanding of the world. From online addictions to transgender rights and sleep disorders. Listen as we discuss some of society's most pressing challenges and uncover some of the ways our research is making a difference.
The menopause journey represents a significant time within the female lifespan. For some, this may be a relatively straightforward process, but for others, their menopause can be very challenging. Most females are likely to experience menopause, yet it remains a topic that is rarely spoken about by the females experiencing it and the health professionals trying to support them. In this episode, we're joined by Dr Jessica Piasecki, who is going to shed some light on the physiological changes that occur during menopause, what happens to our bodies, the hormonal shifts experienced, and why the subject of female health and physiology has often been overlooked in the past.
Jess, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just start by talking a little bit about the menopause. I mean, there's so many people, obviously, all women at some point are going to experience going through the menopause. Can you just tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, the menopause is so important. Females make up 50% of the world's population, so it does happen to a lot of people. The menopause is the end of a female's reproductive life. So throughout the lifespan, we have two primary hormones as females, estrogen and progesterone, and these will ebb and flow through puberty, through a menstrual cycle throughout adulthood, and obviously if a female were to become pregnant or use a hormonal contraceptive, they would change again. But generally, estrogen and progesterone are fairly high throughout the adult lifespan. But then when we reach a time which might be like early 40s or mid to late 50s, for some it is quite varied and very individual. These hormones will begin to fluctuate and they will peak and trough, and with that is associated a number of symptoms, and this is sort of the hormones deteriorating, if you like, and ceasing to exist, and this is the perimenopausal stage, and that's often associated with lots of symptoms, so like brain fog, depression, fatigue, mood swings, temperature fluctuations. So really great time. So then eventually the hormones will tail off and become quite low level and very, very low for the remainder of life if a female doesn't utilize any medication as such. And that would be the menopause, and beyond which females would then be postmenopausal, and estrogen progesterone would be naturally low. So the menopause is the time in which the reproductive lifespan ends and they have this kind of fluctuation period, and then the hormones totally drop off. And it's quite a dramatic time, and obviously associated with those symptoms is quite pivotal in the female lifespan.
And so with so many side effects, and obviously it actually spans quite a large part of a female's life, it's interesting that very little research has ever been done. Why is that?
Yeah, so a lot of research in science particularly is male dominant and has been for a long, long time. So if we look back historically in a lot of physiology research, it is primarily based on males. And, we can think back to way back when, and females didn't have a lot of opportunities to do a lot of things. So why would we then research females in that sense? And a lot of earlier then research beyond that has excluded females because they don't know what these hormones do. But now obviously females are, make up a lot of the workforce. They are predominant in sport as well, and really are a lot more equal to males and have a lot more equal opportunities. There's still a lot of work to be done, but that means that we have to then include these females in research. So we don't necessarily know what happens in the menopause and why all these symptoms arise because the research hasn't been done. But now we are looking to include more females in research and try and gather a bit more detail and understanding of what it is specifically these hormones do. So that might be utilizing a menstrual cycle to try and identify what they do, to then understand why later on in life all these symptoms will arise through the menopause.
And in terms of the research that you've done, what got you into it in the first place?
Yeah, I would say two reasons really. So my experience as an athlete, I always was interested in female physiology. So I was interested in the menstrual cycle and the impact on performance and its regulation and links with energy availability. So the female athlete triad, as it was originally when I first started research. And then when I moved into my PhD, this was focused on aging and how exercise can help our muscles and bones and support our bodies through the aging process. And then I think as I took up my role as a lecturer here at NTU, there was a few years where I was trying to navigate the various systems and decide what I wanted to focus on. But I really sort of married the two then. So doing more female physiology, but with an aging standpoint. I think I'm really interested in more health research than performance because I think it can influence a larger proportion of people. And you can really, very cliche, but I think you really do want to make a difference in anything that we do. So if I can impact more people by understanding what is the menopause and how it influences females particularly, then, I'm hopefully doing a good job. But I really think as well that I understand as well, perhaps from an athletic standpoint, that we can do all this lab testing and it's really, really intricate and detailed, but also it's important to talk to these individuals. And when you talk to females who are particularly going through the menopause, they're so encouraging and they're really a great population to work with. So that sort of strives me to want to do more for this population.
And what is it you found so far through the research that you've done?
Yeah, so at the minute we're trying to focus on our neuromuscular aspects. So what happens as we get older? So if I just give a brief overview, I suppose, to then what we found. So we know females and males age differently. Females live longer than males, but spend a lot more time in poorer health. And one of the reasons for their poor health is a decline in musculoskeletal conditions. So they find it difficult to move, they might have pain, their muscles become weaker, and eventually tasks, around the home might become a lot more difficult. So we want to understand, is there a neuromuscular aspect to that then causes them to deteriorate sort of worse than their male counterparts? So is it the signals from the brain going to the muscles that changes as we get older? And some of our hormones, estrogen and progesterone, we know can cross the blood-brain barrier, so can sort of influence nervous signals from the brain going to our muscles. So knowing that estrogen and progesterone drop off through the menopause, therefore then makes us think there surely must be a big change in neuromuscular performance at that time point. So that's what we're looking into. Does our neuromuscular performance change through this menopause? And we are looking at the moment across that lifespan, so premenopause, so young females, perimenopausal females, and postmenopausal females, and then also looking at the role of HRT. So that would be utilising hormone replacement therapy as a means to sort of not have much of a drop off, and we can use this medication as like a synthetic form of hormone to perhaps not succumb to some of these issues as readily. So what we've found so far is that there is a distinct drop off as we go from peri to post-menopause in both our central and peripheral nervous system functions. So that is signals from the brain and also the nerves to the muscles. So we do a battery of tests that can test both elements of the nervous system, and we do see this change and this decline into older age through the menopause. But what we do see in some of our early findings is that hormone replacement therapy can sort of bump up that level and sort of mitigate some of the losses. It doesn't mean that you're a spring chicken again and you're a young premenopausal female, but it does perhaps support and doesn't mean you drop off as dramatically. We've also found from some of our questionnaire and focus group type work that despite doing a lot of, we're trying to promote this research and so on, a lot of females just don't know where to turn to, and a lot of females don't actually know what's happening within the body. They don't understand that it's the hormones that are changing, and they don't understand the role that these hormones have, not just on our nervous system, but in another array of systems throughout the body. And that might be why explaining how they feel, and I think a lot of females have suggested by explaining it actually helps in the first instance. So we're now sort of following on in both the lab and talking to these females to try and unpick more, and then hopefully deliver kind of intervention type work to really nail down what it is we can to support these females. So hopefully that explained it in a nutshell.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I mean, I think just by listening to your answer then, it really highlights what a big area of study it is, and obviously how many aspects there are to the human body that obviously make up how we feel, and it is a bit of a minefield, and I know just through my own experiences, like it is a conversation and that people are beginning to have, but it isn't, women's health isn't something that I certainly grew up with talking about, and I think it's still not really discussed. I mean, why is that? You know, what impact is that having?
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I think it's generational as well. I think, you know, if I speak to, say, my mum and my mother-in-law, they're like, well, I went through this and I didn't speak to it and I was fine. And then we're now trying to implement, you know, workplace support for the menopause and open discussions about, you know, PMS or endometriosis or all these kinds of things, and better maternity support as well. And it's evolving, but it's also hard for sort of, I suppose, previous females who have gone through that in their own way to then see, oh, why didn't I have that? So it's quite difficult to navigate. And I think a lot of that, again, has stemmed from a lack of knowledge. So if we think about what we were talking about earlier, there wasn't the research available on females to then be able to provide that extra support and have that understanding, though this is an actual thing and it can be quite debilitating to people. We need to provide them better means to be able to do their jobs or to be able to care for their families or do whatever it is that they need to do. And particularly, I think females are very much, I'll just get on with it kind of population. You know, some earlier work from during the pandemic, for instance, sort of highlighted that females were affected more by the change in environment than their males. You know, the males particularly just carried on and went to work as normal, although a change of circumstances perhaps, but females were then loaded with their own work, homeschooling, trying to maintain their own like sanity, own physical activity and well-being, and it very much fell on the females to take up those kinds of roles. So we really need to allow these females to open up and be okay about talking about these things. And I think the starting point is providing that understanding. And that is throughout the female lifespan as well. You know, if we've done some research on menstrual cycle education in schools, and it's very, very haphazard of what is delivered at a school level. And therefore that female is coming through into university or beyond school, whatever it is they do, without that knowledge, then that's going to make them difficult to talk about it because they don't have that confidence or that understanding. So I think it really stems from a young age. If we can provide everybody with that same platform of understanding, then that will encourage those conversations right the way throughout life, and just it should be part of life. This is 50% of the population, so let's just discuss openly and provide that kind of support that there is.
Yeah, it's interesting when you start going back even to sort of like your children, your young people that are actually about to start menstrual cycles and their education, and kind of that ability to be able to talk about it and be open about it perhaps, and the impact that's going to have on their life, and it not to be something to be quiet about. I've got a daughter who's kind of probably getting to that stage, and you know it's always a bit hush-hush still, even amongst their friends, and you think actually it's a conversation that surely should be happening across the board, not just with females, but it's that kind of funny area, isn't it? Whereas it shouldn't be an embarrassment thing. It should be actually, this is what happens. It's part of our bodies, and it's enabling people to be, I guess, as strong and as physically positive throughout these different stages, rather than kind of seeing the limitations, because that's something I'm quite aware of with the menopause conversation. It is always all the really negative stuff. And so there's a lot of getting bogged down in, oh God, this is going to happen, or is this? And there's so many parts that you alluded to earlier, didn't you, Jess, with all the different symptoms. But what almost like at one point in your age and your life, you can almost put everything down to menopause, and that becomes a really negative conversation. And I do feel there's not a lot of positive conversation about what we can actively do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the same is throughout regarding the menstrual cycle as well. You think, okay, we need to talk about this more and all these symptoms, and then you become a bit too acutely aware and you think, oh, is that my menstrual cycle, or is that the menopause? And you sort of overemphasize things. I think it's very much a fine balance, and we want to be able to have these conversations and provide the support where it needs to be. But then we can do things once you have that knowledge and the kind of understanding of your own symptoms. You can do things to preempt them a little bit. So that, I think that goes for the menopause as well. So if you are particularly aware that you struggle with, brain fog and so on, then you can do things to sort of emphasize and pre-activate your cognition function, for want of a better description. It could be you doing some more Sudokus and things like that, more little puzzles and things before you're coming into work and things like that, or doing some activity in the morning, like exercise has been shown to improve cognitive ability, and then going into the workplace and things, and not being bogged down with the brain fog and so on. So I think it's about being aware of, okay, what is it that's going on in my body and what are my symptoms, and then thinking, okay, let's try and preempt it and do something about it. So things like physical activity can actually alleviate some of the symptoms, improving not only like the nervous system pathways when you're telling, I need to move this muscle now, switches on that pathway that might not necessarily be on at that time if you're going through the perimenopause, but you can still utilize these systems, and different nutritional strategies as well might actually help. So I think it's about not succumbing to the symptoms as well, being aware of them, but then also noting what we can do. So, and the support in the workplace will help that. So allowing females, maybe more frequent breaks to allow them to still be productive, but actually giving themselves, it might be just a 5-minute step outside and I'll come back to it, and that helps things a little bit. Going out for walks in the middle of the day, those kinds of things, and just making them know that's available. And it doesn't mean to say that you are any less of a colleague than another. You're just working with your own body at that time, and it wouldn't be, all day, every day, as we know these symptoms change. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We don't want to get bogged down in the symptoms. It's about knowing what they are and then knowing where to go and look for in order to be able to provide that kind of support and the means to alleviate some of these symptoms as well.
So Jess, you were just talking about obviously this space within a workplace for people to recognise when they maybe need to put some slightly different measures in place. At the end of February, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission brought in some new guidance for employers to support workers going through the menopause. I mean, you've just touched on it, but how important is that? I mean, is that going to be quite empowering, or will it help enable, do you think, employers to actually think about it differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right there in what you just said at the end of that, is that it is going to hopefully encourage, and I hope it does, that we should be thinking about this and we should provide the support to these people going through the menopause, and that it will just try and open up that conversations. I think providing the knowledge not only to the menopausal females, but like the line managers and so on, and be able to provide them with that space to say, right, I have got these objectives on my, we call it my HR, don't we, at NTU, but on my, yearly calendar, and this is what I'm meant to meet, but I know that this is going to be the time in which I'm going through perimenopause and some symptoms. So what can we then, as a team, so me and my line manager, do and think about when I'm trying to plan my workload? So just things like that. It doesn't mean that they can't achieve these objectives, but it then might go to the line manager, okay, I don't know, I need to research this. Okay, they go somewhere higher up, and then eventually it might get to, the HR people, and they really need to put in, a policy or provide a space where employees can look and understand what the menopause is. So I think it'll sort of trigger that sort of step-by-step procedure from those people higher up and, in bigger institutes and companies and so on, to really provide that support. And then it might sort of integrate things into the workplace. I know when we've done our sort of group conversations at NTU and got a lot of feedback from these menopausal females, they have said that they don't necessarily know if they can talk about it with their line managers, or is it how it's going to impact their objectives for that year, and how do they have that conversation? So hopefully this act will enable that process to begin. There are probably some places who haven't even thought for 1 second about the menopause. So really for people like that, it'll hopefully allow it to be a little bit more consistent across the board.
With that kind of in mind, and sort of like helping us think about empowering ourselves through this stage of life, is there some sort of tips that you could provide, some advice in terms of where our listeners can go to kind of find out a bit more, the key areas that we should be looking at and thinking about, not just when obviously we have symptoms, but maybe prior to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, first of all, try and educate yourself on what is going through the menopause. So we touched on earlier the changes in hormones. So it's really good to grasp an understanding of what that is. There are a variety of podcasts available. There's like the NHS website. I actually have another podcast called Female Athlete Podcast, and we have a number of episodes on the menopause there, and we've spoken to some certain guests and so on. So I think, first of all, I would definitely try and educate yourself in that. But then in terms of symptom management, there are quite a few things that we can do and have been shown to sort of alleviate some of the symptoms. I think if we think about brain fog is quite a predominant one, and when we've spoken to individuals, that is something that they shout out and say is something that really affects me in work. Like I mentioned earlier, like short bursts of cognitive tasks can be really helpful. So doing things like Sudoku, I know it seems silly, but it is actually really good to sort of get that brain engaged before you're going into the workplace, for example. There are specific cognitive tests you can do, like the Stroop test, but that gets a little bit technical. But just things like that, puzzles, crosswords, and so on, are really good to do. And it might not be you have to do them all day, every day, just intermittently throughout the day or just before you go to work, to just try and engage that pathway, as it were. And even breaking up the day into smaller bits might help if brain fog is something that really affects you. There's a lot of research around like the use of pro and prebiotics now to try and alleviate some symptoms. So a lot of these changes in hormones will elicit like an inflammatory response. So progesterone particularly is inflammatory in its nature. And so we can look to utilize the pre and probiotics in that way to sort of reduce that. And as well, we can look to like anti-inflammatory foods. So just generally healthy foods are predominantly anti-inflammatory. So turmeric is something that's good, but all your fruits and vegetables as well. So making sure you're loading up on those a lot, and that will help with changes as well, and reducing sort of the impact of illness and so on. And then finally, I would say maintaining exercise is obviously really good. That's going to help the neuromuscular system, the musculoskeletal systems, and just being conscious and aware of what it is that might be a symptom in terms, if you get, I think people get joint pain as one. Doesn't mean you can't exercise. There are other things that you can do to move the body. So a brisk walk would still be a good way of moving the body and engaging those kind of pathways, or a swimming to offload the body, or even just a yoga or Pilates very low level. That kind of movement is still really, really good for the body, and particularly the neuromuscular systems that we touched on earlier. So just because you have some kind of symptom that might be a pain related doesn't mean you can't do any exercise. Just work with your body, and again, no, it might ebb and flow. It's not going to be, no, this is the only activity I can do. It might just change on a weekly, daily basis. And then obviously a lot of people experience hot flushes and hot flashes. So if you think about in the workplace, layering up, so you can do either or. If you get particularly hot and cold, don't just go in with one big jumper. Having a fan nearby, and at night people have a spare pillow, or turn the pillow over to make sure it's like cold on one side. And even in the summer months, if you particularly in like a super hot office, having something on your neck to cool you down. So there's a lot of studies that utilize neck cooling now in performance. But you could, get a cold flannel and put it on your neck, and that will particularly cool your body temperature down a little bit. So they would be my top tips and take homes to sort of manage some of the most common symptoms anyway that we see.
And from your perspective as a researcher into the area, where does it need to go to? What are we still missing?
Yeah, so I think we're still missing the general cross-sectional research. So just the inclusivity of females right across the board in all of our research. So if we think about research, it spans so many avenues. If you think about the body, for instance, we must have like 10 physiological systems, and the predominant research is still males. So we need to understand cardiovascular, muscular, the immune system, the endocrine system, all these systems within the body. We need more females in that research. So step one is include the females and redo everything we've done. And then step two would be, drill down into the mechanisms of the menopause. So if we can understand exactly how these hormones operate, then we can do something more preemptively in the future. So if we can understand how they act, like on the nervous system, for instance, then we can think about, okay, prior to the menopause, what can we do to alleviate that change that we'll see as we go through the premenopause? So for instance, if we continue to see what we see in the neuromuscular standpoint, then we know we need to act upon sort of just prior to that perimenopausal stage and do something that will help that nervous system to not change as dramatically. So we need to then investigate what is it that would be. Is it a resistance training exercise intervention? Is it a cognitive-based intervention? Is it a bit of both? So we then need to design these specific regimes that will help alleviate and manage this change in our bodies better, to allow females to live as long as they are, but in much better health. So there's 3 points, I think, that need to be addressed. So, we'll be here a while, I think, but we can make a start, certainly.
And as females, what can we do? What would be the biggest sort of change that we could all make?
Yeah, I think just being open about this topic with your peers, I think that's a really good start. And providing the knowledge to other peers that might not know as well. And also supporting younger generations. So we spoke about if we could change that earlier, then that generation has a lot more hope, I suppose, and just having a different way of approaching this pathway and being female, addressing those hormones and knowing what they do. I think it would be really important if we can build that in from a young age and allow that conversation to ebb and flow with everybody, whether you're male, female, whichever you choose. I think it's really important to have that open discussion right from the word go. So if we can do that, then I think a lot of our problems in terms of not being able to speak about it and the support would be able to be answered.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier on about the kind of speaking with our older members of family, of society, and the fact that, we did this, we didn't need to talk about it. And it is really changing how you think about it in your mind. And I mentioned my daughter earlier, and it does make me think, as in, wasn't something, menstrual cycles and so forth, wasn't something that we really talked about as a family. It's just something that happened. And I know that I'm having to try and rethink the way that maybe I address it, because there is more conversation, and it really is something that needs to filter through from the beginning. And as you said, the education perhaps in schools needs to be a bit more consistent.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of that work we've done has been really, really interesting, actually. And it's led by a researcher in Swansea, and there's a few others that span sort of England, Scotland, Wales. So we've got a good representation of their education in schools. And some of the teachers that we've approached, and we've said, could we, look into and support you with this menstrual cycle education? They're like, no, we don't teach that here. oh my goodness, no. So it's really, really surprising, you know, and that's 2024, 2023 when we were looking into it, and it's shocking, really. But then when we've spoken to pupils as well as teachers, the pupils themselves have said, we would really like this extra detail. We don't want it to just be a tick box exercise. We want to have that support. And, you know, these are people who are, say, 11 to 13. And that's obviously like a key time within a female lifespan. If they're going through that education in school already, like having to shy away from it, then that's not really giving them a good platform for later on in life. So if we can really build on that, and we have worked with some schools now to like deliver specific detailed menstrual cycle sort of, we've created a few lessons for them to deliver, and they are really engaging. I think it's tricky where, like you mentioned earlier, do you teach it with the boys? You know, at that young age, you want the girls to engage, but you also want them to be able to have this open conversation. So is it a bit of both? Do you merge them all in together? Because, you know, they're still 10, 11 years old. You're not going to change that. And there will be some like, oh, what's this, a period? But I think it's more that you don't want them to just come away with it, oh, I bleed. It's about, this is a process, you know, it's a whole 28-day cycle. And with shedding my uterine lining, I'm not bleeding. This is what's happening. And then my hormones change at this point, and then they change again. And then it's science, as it were. That's all it is. And it has to be natural. So I think in my mind, it needs to be, okay, we have the initial conversation with the girls. Then we bring the boys and girls together, and then we support the girls throughout and provide them with that, you know, whether it's one teacher they can go to or to have that conversation. But it definitely needs to change. It was quite obvious from that, and the pupils want that as well. And I think that would really create a whole different generation, and make that conversation you want with your daughter to just be entirely normal, which, yeah, is difficult to navigate.
Yeah, and I think it's about wanting every female at all ages be able to live their optimal life, isn't it?
Exactly.
And I guess that's by our responsibility to educate ourselves to understand how we can get our bodies to perform the best we want them to do, whatever that is.
Yeah, exactly. We don't want people to think, you know, oh, I can't do anything on this day, that day. It's about, wow, this is a powerful tool. You know, this is really something that as a female is really unique, and it's quite amazing. Actually, you can grow an entire human that is all because of this menstrual cycle. You know, it's a very good power. And I think it's about providing them with that narrative rather than, you know, oh, I bleed, it's disgusting. It's like, okay, this is actually a tool you can utilize to then optimize and be a really cool whatever it is you want to be. And, you know, if we look towards sport, for example, we can see a lot of athletes now saying, I did this when I was on my period, or I've done this and it doesn't have to limit you in any way or any shape or form. So yeah, if we can provide that to all females, then that would be really good. I've 4 young nieces, and I try and just talk to them openly about it as much as possible. And you just hope they're going to be comfortable in their own bodies for as long as possible. That is like what I would love to see them grow up to do.
Jess, thank you so much. It's been really interesting. And as we've said throughout it, it affects 50% of the population. So it's such a valuable and important conversation to be having. All the best with all the research, because we obviously need to keep on that track as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great to be here.
If you want to find out more about Jess's research, please have a look in the episode description. You've been listening to the Research Reimagined podcast by Nottingham Trent University. For all of the latest news from the research community at NTU, follow us on Twitter at NTU_research, or sign up to our research newsletter by visiting ntu.ac.uk/research. Thanks for listening.